Hey folks, it's Jürgen here at Polymash, and today we are continuing our series on the Rodecaster Pro features that were introduced with the Firmware 2.1 release. And today we're going to talk about the Aural Exciter. We've got a little bit of a different setup, a different experiment going on, and let's roll right into it. So first of all, you're hearing me through a lavalier mic. I've got actually a couple of different mics set up today, and that's what makes it a little different because I have to move around a bit between looking at the Rodecaster Pro's interface and a few other things. So I'm excited about this one. In one of the last one of the last videos in the series that we did, a couple of questions came up around equalization. And I want to explore today kind of an interesting question, I hope. So with that, let me jump in and walk through what I'm hoping to do during this video. And during this part, as you'll hear me switch between a bunch of different mics, I'm wearing a lav mic, as I said. For some of what we're doing today, we'll be listening to the Rode Procaster microphone, which they so generously gifted to me. I'm amazed at that. It was great. Customer support from Rode is par none, and I had an issue with one of their devices, and they just gifted me this microphone, which is awesome, right? To make up for it, that's customer service times 10. And also, I've got a ATR 2005 mic hooked up as well that we're going to be playing with to do some of what I wanted to cover today. And what is that, you ask? Well, let's jump right in. Okay, so what I'd like to cover today is a feature in the Rodecaster Pro firmware release that allows us to change the settings on the Aphex Aural exciter. And the reason that I want to talk about that is that, as you guys know, with the Rodecaster Pro firmware updates that were recently released, we now have the ability to modify almost all the effects that come on board. And that's awesome to be able to really emulate the sound that you might get on a podcast or elsewhere. And in one of the previous videos where we were talking about optimizing the noise gate, and if you are curious about those, just subscribe to our channel. We have a playlist on the Rodecaster Pro 2.1 firmware release specifically. But one of the questions that came up, like, hey, still no EQ? And I know I was wondering about that as well, as to why Rode chose to not include an equalizer. The console didn't have one before. Clearly, if you're doing post-production work or if you're going through an audio interface, it might be that you're doing EQ with outboard gear, or you're doing EQ in the post-processing in Adobe Audition or elsewhere. And so the question that occurred to me that I want to dive into a little bit today is, could we use the Aural exciter, which has been much maligned and a lot of people complain about or don't like, or just turn off and say, just forget that. And, it's a great piece of kit, but just turn off the Aural exciter. I've heard that a lot in the past. But that was before we could modify the settings and introduce as little or as much of that as we wanted to. And so that's the question that I kind of want to address today. Can we use it as a substitute for EQ? And just to clarify the use case again, because I'm going to get emails and comments again, as I did on previous videos, what we're talking about here is for situations where what you're doing with this console is where post-production is impossible or where it's not desired. And, I could think of a bunch of reasons where that's the case. For example, on-the-fly audio productions, if you're doing daily shows on a podcast, if you're doing live streaming, situations in which you want to get and optimize your sound, but you might not have the time to do a post-production cycle after the initial recording. So for live streaming and broadcast, that's perfect. And so, I would not use any of these settings to actually record into the original audio. But just to clarify, what the Rodecaster does or can do is that it allows you to output the original untouched tracks when you're recording with Adobe Audition or any other DAW. The connection to your PC or Mac can provide the original audio that's untouched by any of the live stream broadcasted audio. When you're using it as a USB interface, you can still output the sound to either a live stream or elsewhere where you use the effects and take advantage of them, such as the noise gate. I work in a very noisy environment, so the noise gate for me is kind of a good thing when I'm recording live streams. Somebody was asking, well, how do you do that exactly? Let me just switch. As I said, we have kind of a complex setup today. So I'm going to switch over to where we are seeing the meters and the meter display on the Rodecaster Pro itself. And for that, I'm going to switch over to my lavalier mic. So forgive the sound quality difference now. You should be hearing me on the lavalier. I'll turn that down just a little bit. But what we're looking at here is I just wanted to show where that lives. So the ability under hardware, under advanced and multi-track, you can actually determine whether or not you want to bypass the audio processing. And you can even listen post-fader, which just means that, that means you're listening to it with the effects. And here you can say, well, when I'm recording to my DAW, I don't want the audio effects from this console. I want to output the original non-fader based audio. So, but today what I want to do is I'm going to switch over to Adobe Audition and look at some spectral analysis. So I want the Aphex Exciter and noise gate and other features here. I actually want them to be in the recording in this particular instance. So I'm kind of hoping that makes sense. Switching back to my regular mic, and so that's how you switch the settings to record your original audio content to your Adobe Audition or DAW of choice, and that's what you would do if you're doing a proper recording. So I hope that kind of clarifies the use cases, and maybe we should talk about also what's an aural exciter anyway. Back in my days when I was doing a bit of studio production in New York City in the 90s, we used a bunch of outboard gear, compressors, and so forth during, recording sessions. That's basically what you would do. And an audio exciter, actually the Aphex Exciter, has been around for a long time. It's just that the software versions of that, plugins and, the introduction of these into mixing consoles like the Rodecaster Pro is a more recent phenomena. So what an exciter is, it's called a harmonic exciter. The Wikipedia definition is that it's a audio signal processing technique used to enhance a signal by dynamic equalization. So there's that word, EQ, and phase manipulation and harmonic synthesis of usually high-frequency signals and through the addition of subtle harmonic distortion. Well, that's a mouthful. But we're going to break that down into parts that I hope are going to be useful for us to understand what this thing does and maybe how we can actually use it in subtle but effective ways. So the use cases for that are typically that you'd restored old recordings by simulating sort of the lost spectral content that you would get from like old worn out tape or records and so forth. That's what the use case or what the invention was supposed to do originally. And also if your recordings are sort of dull and you need to add some sparkle or analog reel-to-reel tapes, that's what it was used to sort of reintroduce some sparkle by, I guess, taking harmonics and then multiplying them and, and phase shifting them slightly. So that's what the definition is. So the question that I then want to ask is, could we use this, since the complaint was that, hey, the Rodecaster Pro doesn't have an EQ, could we use this as an EQ? And that, from my perspective, in a word, no. But I think we could work towards the goal of what an EQ is. So I don't want to give anyone the idea that this is as good as or the same as or as easy to use or will do exactly the same thing as an EQ does. But still, the goals that an EQ has and why we use one in audio recordings, especially vocal recordings, we could use the aural exciter as a substitute for an EQ. That's kind of my investigation or my hypothesis. And so I want to kind of go into how we've played with this and how I'm trying to use it to emulate or approximate what an EQ does. And so if we look at what a typical EQ does, let's jump over into Adobe Audition for a second. So if I look at a track here, I'm just right now live recording this track that's coming through. And I'm just going to pull up the typical AQ, and I'm going to zoom into that a little bit to hopefully make that clearer and get that on the screen a little larger. I hope you guys can see this good. Obviously when there is no EQ, it's a flat curve, and so a parametric equalizer is probably the EQ type that we're all most familiar with. And with the parametric EQ, if I look at Adobe Audition's sort of typical vocal enhancer, let's see what it does. So it has a roll-off or low frequencies below 80 hertz. Well, the Rodecaster Pro also offers that as part of the effect package. It's not part of the Aural Exciter, but it's available, so you can emulate that. The next thing is that a vocal enhancer typically sort of adds a little bit of bass or that broadcasty sound. In this case, their default settings boost the 110 hertz range by about 6 decibels, and that's this little bump that you're seeing on the graph here. So that, when we're looking at the actual Aural Exciter settings, is similar to, that is what they refer to as big bottom. Okay, so what I'm proposing here is that the addition of lower frequencies can be done and sort of approximated with the big bottom portion of it. Then, in their settings, they sort of dip the 300 hertz range just a little bit. I think that's a very subtle thing. And depending on whether it's a female or male vocal, you may have less or none or more of that. The other thing that typically happens is that you might use a de-esser, and you might use a parametric EQ as a form of de-esser if you wanted to. Like that would look something like, if we were to activate that, around the 4,000 hertz range, and if you were to dip that down, and actually the Q is the Q value, or the width of that, is typically pretty narrow, and that would just sort of the sibilant sound where the S's are, that's around typically where it happens, and this particular setting would reduce that. And that's also available as a separate sort of effect within the Aphex series of effects that are available. Again, not part of the Aural Exciter. The Aural Exciter comes into the last portion of what's happening here, and that is when the typical vocal enhancer settings that a lot of people recommend is to sort of add some presence in and above the 10K range, or sort of ramp that up gradually, and to add some sparkle into the upper registers and upper octaves of where the human voice typically operates. And that is where if I'm looking back at the Aural Exciter portion again, that is where the Aural Exciter can come into play and actually help us do some of that. So that's how a typical EQ setting works in Adobe Audition and elsewhere. So let's continue. So the question then is, what EQ goals could we achieve by using the Aphex Aural Exciter? So I'm saying that adding that lower bass boost for voices that need it, adding that high frequency sparkle to voices in the presence range, and using it as a way to achieve some presence boost, if you will. The de-esser effect to sort of do a cut at 4K. So here then are some tips on how to use the Aural Exciter. So we can use the drive setting, and just switch over the settings that are available to us, are actually drive. It's on the big bottom. That's the language of it. Harmonics, tune, and mix are the Aphex Aural Exciter settings, and tune, drive, and mix are the available parameters that you can change on the big bottom. So drive then increases the harmonic distortion, and I'll go very, very subtle with that, and we'll try that in a minute using the Audio-Technica AT2005, which is a typical sort of a podcaster microphone, and I'm going to try to demo some of this on that sound in a minute. Mix then is the overall strength of the effect. That's just how much dry signal versus wet signal goes into the actual final. And tune, as far as the Aphex Aural exciter is concerned, tune is sort of the baseline as to what frequency is being used to introduce harmonics that are going to make up this, this sparkle on the higher register, or this addition of presence that the typical settings on an Adobe Audition vocal enhancer settings include. And so also, I remember from studio days, it was that using these aural exciters with just a little bit of compression before it gets into the mix made them more predictable in the old day. And so that came from, like many industry folks, back in New York City. So let's have a look as to how we would actually kind of do this. So I'm going to switch over again to the aural exciter, and I'm going to put myself on mute. And now you're hearing me through the AT2005, and I think I have everything turned off, but I'm going to see. So I'm going to look at the channel strip for this and look at the settings and go back and make sure that all the effects are off. So yes, the compressor is off at the moment. The noise gate is on at the moment, but that's just because I'm in super noisy environment and it really doesn't make that much of a difference. The de-esser is off, and the Aphex is off, and the high pass filter, that's still on to just reduce any low rumble below 60 in this case, and the reverb is off too. So let's go into the aural exciter, and I'm going to change these settings to make it really, really obvious so that it's audible when I switch over. So you're hearing my voice now without it, and now you're hearing it with it. And you can probably hear a pretty unpleasant sort of introduction of harmonics and, and if I go even more pronounced, you would now see what this sounds like. Very terrible, right? It's sibilant, but this is what I was saying. The mix can be used to just dial all of that all the way back out to where there's no difference between turning it on and off, except for I have to make sure that the big bottom isn't turned on either. So the harmonics introduced is this level of distortion, and that's what I would wouldn't introduce too many. So I keep that setting like really low, and now if I'm playing with the mix, again, this introduces some of it, and you can hear that it introduces this little bit of a presence boost, starting with harmonics at 3000 hertz, but then it gets, via octaves, it gets higher and higher. And you can change, depending on what voice you're dealing with, you can change the baseline tuning of which harmonic frequency is used to derive these harmonics from. And then the mix is just, how much of this you introduce. Again, so this is with it on, this is with it off, but I would dial that way, way, way down. And I think that's what the criticism was of using something like this. Now I've got a much more subtle sort of a difference. So if you hear the upper registers of my voice and sort of the S's, now it's it introduces just a little bit of, I think, more pleasant sort of a sound. So you can use the aural exciter to start introducing that sort of a sparkle that you would in post-processing, and see whether you can approximate, what that looks like. Now, the other thing that I thought we would try is I have a white noise generator app here, and I'm going to use that on my iPhone to basically bleed some white noise into this microphone. And then what I'd like to do is go back into Adobe Audition and go to a spectral display, and I wanted to compare, the snapshot of white noise. And what you're looking at here are two lines The red line represents a white noise curve with the Adobe Aural Exciter turned on, and the green one represents it with it turned off. And so you can sort of see that, it's boosting in the lower registers, and, then again, it starts to introduce this presence boost across the 3,000, 4,000, 500, 1,000, 6,000 hertz range. And, sort of like beyond this for the human voice, it's not all that meaningful in terms of, our ability to hear, as, the human voice really, plays more between the, it's really more in the 1,000 to 2, 3, 4, 5,000 range. But that's what's happening with the white noise curve. I thought that was kind of an interesting look, right? So if I turn this on, I'm gonna do this live again. So now with this white noise, I'm going to capture a curve, and it's being recorded through the ATR 2005 microphone. I'm going to just position it slightly differently. And now you're hearing me through that mic again. And as you see here, we have the Aural Exciter enabled. I'm going to just, again, really exaggerate that. And I'm also going to make sure that the big bottom is turned on, so that we can kind of see the difference between this turned on and that turned off. And so with the white noise curve now, let's look at the white noise with it turned on and then the white noise with it turned off, and we should be able to see sort of what the Aural Exciter is introducing. So give this just a moment. That is the curve that we captured with the Aural Exciter on. And now let me turn the Aural Exciter off again. So here we have the difference, and I'm going to not have this be displayed or live right now, but here we have the difference. So you can sort of see that the Aural Exciter is increasing a little bit on the bass frequencies, and then starting at about 3K, and then all across the range it has that presence boost. So my argument is that you could try to match the settings that you might have in your podcast recordings or elsewhere, the vocal preference settings that you might use in Adobe Audition, that a parametric equalizer does. You could try to sort of match that and then dial it way back so that it's subtle enough to where it's not unpleasant and where you're getting good results. So I thought that's really the message that I wanted to sort of play with today. Again, I'm not saying it's an EQ, but I think that we could use it to approximate an EQ, and that was really the point of this video. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. See you in the next video, and subscribe to the channel if you think this kind of content is useful. I think for me, it's like, I've learned a little bit about how I might use the Aural Exciter and, have just a little bit of it in trying to like emulate an EQ. And I'm hoping that that's making sense for all the folks that are watching. So until next time, signing off, it's Jürgen at Polymash. Bye for now.